This means that without discernment, a person can easily be led astray, manipulated, or deceived by forces working against God's will. There are people in this world who carry spirits that are not of God. They may look harmless, they may even use religious language, but their words and actions are rooted in confusion, manipulation, and destruction. Some of them don't even realize they are being used by the enemy, but whether they are aware of it or not, their influence can pull you away from the truth. That is why spiritual discernment is not an option, it is a necessity. When Jesus walked the earth, he encountered people who outwardly appeared righteous, but inwardly were full of wickedness. The Pharisees knew the scriptures, they followed religious traditions, yet their hearts were far from God. Jesus did not waste time trying to explain himself to them. He knew their intentions. He saw through their words, and he recognized the spirit behind their accusations. This is the same wisdom believers need today. Not everyone who questions you is seeking the truth. Some are simply looking for a way to trap you, to make you doubt, to stir up confusion in your spirit. If you lack discernment, you will find yourself constantly defending your faith, explaining your actions, and trying to prove yourself to people who have no desire to understand. Discernment comes from walking closely with God. It is not something gained by intellect alone, nor can it be acquired simply by experience. It is a spiritual gift, and it grows as you spend time in prayer, in the Word, and in the presence of God. The more you align yourself with the Spirit of God, the more you will recognize when something is not right. You will feel it in your spirit when a conversation is meant to pull you into unnecessary strife. You will sense it when a person's words are laced with deception. You will recognize when the enemy is trying to use someone to weaken your faith. Many believers fall into the trap of trying to reason with spirits that have already rejected the truth. They engage in endless debates, hoping that logic will change a heart that has been hardened. But the enemy does not operate in logic. He operates in deception. No amount of explaining will convince a person whose spirit is closed off to God. This is why Jesus warned against casting pearls before swine. It is not because the truth is not valuable, but because those who refuse to receive it will only trample on it and turn against you. The enemy wants you to waste your time arguing with people who have no intention of hearing the truth. He wants you distracted, frustrated, and drained. But God has called you to walk in wisdom. There is a time to speak, and there is a time to remain silent. There is a time to share the truth, and there is a time to walk away. When Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, he did not entertain the devil's questions. He responded with the Word of God, and he moved forward. He did not linger, he did not explain, and he did not try to convince the enemy of who he was. This is the example believers must follow. You do not owe an explanation to those who are being used to distract and deceive. Your responsibility is to walk in truth, to stand firm in faith, and to listen to the voice of God above all others. If you do not develop discernment, you will find yourself constantly entangled in unnecessary battles, wasting energy on people who do not want to see the light. But when you walk in discernment, you will recognize the tactics of the enemy and refuse to engage in fruitless conversations. Some of the greatest attacks against your faith will not come from obvious enemies, but from those who appear well-intentioned. They will come with kind words, with deep questions, with flattering speech, but their spirit will be in opposition to God's truth. This is why discernment is essential. It protects you from deception, it keeps you from unnecessary conflict, and it allows you to stay focused on the path God has set before you. The Bible tells us to test every spirit, to weigh every word, to measure everything against the truth of God's Word. It does not say to accept everything at face value. There are voices that will try to pull you off course, voices that will make you question what God has spoken to you. But when you have discernment, you will recognize what is from God and what is not. You will not be easily shaken, you will not be easily deceived, and you will not waste time explaining yourself to spirits that have already rejected the truth. Jesus faced opposition from the moment he began his ministry. Though he came with a message of love, salvation, and truth, there were those who rejected him, challenged him, and sought to destroy him. The religious leaders of his time, men who were supposed to represent God, became his greatest enemies. They could not deny his miracles, they could not disprove his wisdom, but their hearts were hardened and they refused to believe. They tested him with trick questions, hoping he would say something they could use against him. They accused him of blasphemy, of lawlessness, of being possessed by demons. No matter what he did, no matter how clearly he revealed the truth, they opposed him at every turn. Jesus understood that some people were not looking for truth. He knew that no amount of explanation would satisfy those who had already made up their minds to reject him. When the Pharisees demanded a sign, he refused to perform miracles just to prove himself. When they questioned his authority, he did not argue with them. He spoke the truth boldly, but he did not waste time explaining himself to those who had no desire to listen. Even when he stood before Pilate, falsely accused and sentenced to death, he remained silent. He could have defended himself. He could have called down legions of angels to rescue him, but he knew his purpose. He knew the opposition was part of the path he had to walk. The opposition against Jesus did not only come from religious leaders, it came from his own people. The very ones he came to save rejected him. They praised him when he performed miracles, but they turned against him when he spoke hard truths. When he fed the 5,000, they followed him eagerly. But when he told them that he was the bread of life, many walked away. The same crowd that shouted Hosanna as he entered Jerusalem later cried out, "Crucify him!" Their loyalty was shallow. Their faith was temporary, and when they were given a choice, they chose Barabbas over the Son of God. Even those closest to Jesus struggled to stand with him. Peter, the disciple who declared he would never deny Christ, denied him 3 times in one night. Judas, one of the 12, betrayed him for 30 pieces of silver. When Jesus was arrested, his disciples scattered in fear. He stood alone before his accusers, facing the hatred of men who should have recognized him as the Messiah. Yet, in the face of all this opposition, he did not waver. He did not change his message to please the crowds. He did not back down to avoid conflict. He did not soften the truth to make it more acceptable. He remained faithful to his mission, knowing that the rejection of men did not change the truth of God. Opposition did not stop Jesus from fulfilling his purpose. He healed on the Sabbath, even when the religious leaders condemned him for it. He spoke to sinners and outcasts even when it ruined his reputation in the eyes of the self-righteous. He preached against hypocrisy, even when it made powerful enemies. He knew that standing for the truth would bring resistance. He knew that people would hate him, misunderstand him, twist his words, and falsely accuse him. But he never allowed opposition to silence him. Jesus warned his followers that they too would face opposition. He said, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first." He knew that the same forces that worked against him would work against those who follow him. The enemy does not attack those who are walking in darkness. He goes after those who carry the light. If Jesus, who was perfect, who was love itself, who performed miracles in broad daylight, faced rejection and opposition, how much more will his followers face the same? The opposition against Jesus was not a sign that he was wrong, it was proof that he was right. The darkness does not welcome the light. The enemy does not celebrate the truth. Those who are comfortable in sin do not rejoice when righteousness is revealed. That is why those who walked in darkness despised him. That is why those with hardened hearts resisted him. That is why the world still tries to silence his name today. The opposition Jesus faced did not define him, and it did not stop him. He knew who he was. He knew his purpose. He knew that no amount of resistance could change the truth. He walked through opposition with authority, with confidence, with unwavering faith. He did not waste time explaining himself to those who refused to see. He did not seek approval from those who would never give it. He stayed on the path God had set before him, knowing that no amount of opposition could stop what God had already ordained. Not every battle is yours to fight. There are times when people will challenge you, question you, provoke you, and try to drag you into conflicts that have nothing to do with your purpose. Some arguments are designed to drain you, not to enlighten you. Some confrontations are meant to pull you off course, not to build you up. The enemy knows that if he can keep you fighting unnecessary battles, he can keep you distracted from the real war. He doesn't always come with obvious attacks. Sometimes he simply places people and situations in your path that demand your energy, your peace, and your attention, knowing that if he can get you to engage, he can get you to lose focus. Jesus understood this better than anyone. He was constantly surrounded by people trying to trap him with questions, trying to stir up division, trying to provoke him into responding in ways that would give them an excuse to accuse him. The Pharisees came to him over and over, hoping to catch him in his words, asking him about taxes, about the law, about authority. He answered them when it served his purpose, but he never allowed their challenges to pull him into unnecessary disputes. He did not fight every battle that was placed before him. He chose his battles wisely because he understood that not every battle was worth his time. When Jesus stood before Pilate, falsely accused and on trial for his life, he did not argue. He did not defend himself against the lies spoken against him. He knew the battle was not his to fight, it belonged to God. He could have called down legions of angels. He could have spoken in such a way that no one could have refuted him. But he stood silent because he understood that the greater victory was in surrendering to the will of God rather than engaging in a fight that would not change the outcome. Many believers waste their strength on the wrong battles. They spend time defending themselves against people who will never believe them. They argue with those who have no interest in hearing the truth. They try to explain themselves to those who are committed to misunderstanding them. They fight for approval from people who will never give it. They allow their emotions to be stirred by every insult, every false accusation, every attack that comes their way, forgetting that some battles are meant to be ignored, not fought. There are times when the enemy will use people to provoke you, not because the argument itself matters, but because he knows that if he can get you emotionally involved, he can get you off track. He will use small offenses to create division. He will use personal attacks to stir up bitterness. He will use lies to make you feel the need to defend yourself. But not every accusation needs a response. Not every insult needs a reaction. Not every challenge needs an answer. There are moments when the best thing you can do is remain silent and let God handle the battle. David understood this when he faced Goliath. His brothers mocked him, the soldiers doubted him, and even King Saul questioned him. He could have spent time arguing with them, trying to prove that he was capable, but instead he focused on the real enemy. He ignored the distractions and went straight to the battle that mattered. And because he did not waste his energy on unnecessary conflicts, He had the strength to defeat the giant that no one else could face. There will always be people who try to pull you into their battles. They will try to make you prove yourself. They will question your motives, your faith, your calling. They will stir up confusion and strife, hoping you will take the bait. But wisdom teaches that strength is not in fighting every battle. It is in knowing which battles are worth fighting. The enemy would love nothing more than to see you spend your life fighting against distractions while neglecting the real purpose God has placed on your life. Some battles are meant to be left in God's hands. Some conflicts are designed to test your patience rather than your strength. Some attacks are meant to be endured, not engaged. The greatest victories are not always won through struggle, but through surrender to God's plan. The moment you realize that not every battle is yours to fight, you free yourself from the burden of unnecessary conflict and step into the power of divine wisdom. Faith over explanation means standing firm in what you believe without feeling the need to justify yourself to those who will never understand. Faith does not require the approval of people. It does not seek validation from the world. It does not beg for acceptance. When God speaks, when He moves in your life, when He leads you down a path that others do not comprehend, faith teaches you to walk forward without stopping to explain yourself to those who refuse to see. One of the greatest examples of faith over explanation is Abraham. God told him to leave his country, his people, and everything familiar to go to a land that He would show him. There was no map, no detailed plan, no evidence of what was to come, only a command from God. Abraham could have argued. He could have demanded answers. He could have sought validation from others before stepping out, but he didn't. He walked by faith, not by sight. He did not waste time explaining himself to those who would have called him foolish. He moved forward because he trusted that God's word was enough. The world operates on reason, on logic, on tangible proof. Faith operates on trust in what cannot be seen. That is why those who live by faith will always be misunderstood by those who live by sight. Noah was mocked for building the ark when there was no sign of rain. Moses was doubted when he told Pharaoh that God would deliver his people. Even Jesus was ridiculed for claiming to be the Son of God. Over and over, history shows that those who follow God's voice will always be questioned by those who cannot hear it. But faith does not require explanation. Faith moves forward, even when others doubt, even when they laugh, even when they call you crazy. Jesus never felt the need to explain himself to those who were spiritually blind. When the Pharisees demanded a sign, he did not give them one. When the religious leaders questioned his authority, he did not try to prove himself. He spoke the truth and let those who had ears to hear receive it. He knew that no amount of explanation would convince those whose hearts were already hardened. That is the wisdom of faith. It does not waste time trying to persuade those who have already chosen unbelief. Too many people spend their lives trying to explain what God has spoken to them. They want their family to understand, their friends to agree, their critics to accept their decisions. They feel the need to justify every step, to provide proof before they move, to gain approval before they obey. But faith does not wait for permission. Faith follows God even when no one else understands. Faith does not argue with those who will never see. Faith does not plead for acceptance from those who have already rejected the truth. When Peter stepped out of the boat to walk on water, he did not stop to explain his decision to the other disciples. He did not wait for their approval. He did not ask them if they thought it was a good idea. He simply stepped out because Jesus had called him. The moment he started to focus on the wind and the waves, the voices of doubt, the opinions of others, the logic of his mind, that is what happens when faith is replaced with explanation. When you seek to justify your steps instead of simply taking them, you allow room for doubt to creep in. Faith will always be challenged by those who do not have it. The enemy will use people to question you, to make you second guess what God has spoken, to make you feel the need to explain yourself. But faith is not a debate. Faith does not ask for permission. Faith does not live by human reasoning. When God calls, faith obeys. When God speaks, faith moves. Faith does not require an explanation because the only approval that matters is God's. Spiritual attacks often come through people, not because they are the source of the attack, but because the enemy uses them as vessels to carry out his plans. The Bible tells us that we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness in this world. This means that the real battle is not with the people who hurt you, lie about you, betray you, or try to destroy you. The battle is with the unseen forces working behind them, influencing their actions, using their words, and fueling their hatred. The enemy knows that one of the easiest ways to shake your faith, steal your joy, and pull you away from your purpose is to use people to attack you. He will use those closest to you because their words cut the deepest. He will use people in authority because their rejection carries weight. He will use strangers to discourage you, to plant seeds of doubt, to make you question yourself. If he cannot stop you directly, he will send people to do his work for him. And if you are not spiritually discerning, you will waste your energy fighting people instead of recognizing the real enemy behind the attack. Jesus experienced this throughout his ministry. The religious leaders opposed him at every turn, trying to trap him with their words, twisting his message and accusing him of wrongdoing. They could not deny his power, they could not refute his wisdom, but their hearts were hardened and they allowed themselves to be used as instruments of attack. Even among his own disciples, the enemy found an opportunity. When Jesus told his followers that he would suffer and die, Peter rebuked him, telling him that such a thing should never happen. But Jesus recognized the real source of the words and responded, "Get behind me, Satan." He was not calling Peter the devil, but he was addressing the spirit that was influencing him at that moment. That is, spiritual discernment. Knowing when the attack is not about the person speaking, but about the spirit behind their words. Judas is another example. He walked with Jesus, heard his teachings, saw his miracles, yet in the end he allowed himself to be used as a tool of betrayal. The Bible says that Satan entered into Judas, and from that moment he set out to betray the Son of God. The enemy needed someone on the inside, someone close enough to Jesus to hand him over, and he found that opportunity in a man who had already opened his heart to greed and deception. This is how spiritual attacks work. The enemy looks for weaknesses, for open doors, for unresolved bitterness, for unchecked pride, and he uses people who have already given him access to carry out his attacks. Many believers struggle with anger and resentment because they take spiritual attacks personally. They spend years holding grudges against people who hurt them, never realizing that those people were being used by something much greater than themselves. This is why Jesus could pray for those who crucified him, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." He understood that they were being used. He knew that their actions, as painful as they were part of a larger spiritual battle. He did not waste time hating them because he saw beyond the physical attack to the spiritual war behind it. If you are walking in obedience to God, you will face opposition. The enemy does not attack those who are walking in darkness. He goes after those who carry the light. He will send people to distract you, to provoke you, to test your patience, to discourage you, to make you question what God has spoken to you. He will use those closest to you to plant seeds of doubt, to make you feel unworthy, to stir up conflict in your spirit. If you do not have discernment, you will find yourself fighting people instead of recognizing the real battle. You will waste your energy in arguments, in frustration, in bitterness, instead of standing firm in the truth and resisting the enemy's schemes. The Bible tells us to put on the full armor of God so that we can stand against the attacks of the enemy. It does not say to fight every person who opposes us. It does not say to argue with every critic, to defend ourselves against every false accusation, to prove ourselves to those who misunderstand us. It says to stand firm, to resist the devil, to walk in truth, to cover ourselves with righteousness, to guard our hearts, to stay in prayer. This is how you fight a spiritual attack. Not by battling the people being used against you, but by standing in the authority that God has given you. Spiritual attacks often come through people, but they do not define you. They do not have the power to stop what God is doing in your life. They do not have the authority to cancel your calling. When you recognize the battle for what it is, you stop reacting in the flesh and start responding in the spirit. You stop wasting time trying to explain yourself, trying to win arguments, trying to prove your worth, and you start focusing on the real fight, the one that is not against flesh and blood, but against the unseen forces working behind the scenes. Guard your peace and your purpose, because the enemy will do everything he can to steal them from you. If he cannot stop you from believing, he will try to make you restless. If he cannot take away your calling, he will try to distract you from it. He knows that a believer who is at peace and walking in their purpose is dangerous to his kingdom. That is why he sends people, situations, and thoughts to shake you, to make you doubt, to pull you away from what God has assigned you to do. Peace is not just the absence of trouble, it is the presence of God in the middle of it. It is the kind of peace that allows you to sleep in the storm, to stand in the fire, to walk through the valley without fear. It is the kind of peace that Jesus had when he stood before Pilate, falsely accused, but completely calm. He did not defend himself. He did not argue with his accusers. He did not let their lies disturb his spirit. He knew who he was, and he knew that no amount of opposition could change his purpose. That is the peace the enemy wants to take from you. He wants you to live in anxiety, constantly defending yourself, constantly explaining yourself, constantly feeling the need to prove yourself. But the moment you give in to that battle, you lose your focus. The enemy does not need to destroy you if he can distract you. If he can keep your mind occupied with things that do not matter, if he can get you caught up in unnecessary drama, if he can stir up conflict in your heart, he can pull you away from your purpose without you even realizing it. That is why you must be careful about what you allow into your spirit. You must be careful about the conversations you engage in, the battles you fight, the energy you give to things that do not serve your calling. Jesus never let distractions pull him away from his mission. He did not waste time arguing with those who had already made up their minds to reject him. He did not chase after people who walked away from him. He did not explain himself to those who had no desire to understand. He stayed focused on what God had sent him. That is the example we must follow. There are people who will try to disrupt your peace. They will test you, provoke you, misunderstand you, lie about you. The enemy will use them to pull you into arguments, to make you react in ways that take your focus off of God. That is why you must guard your peace. You must recognize when a situation is a trap, when a conversation is not worth having, when a battle is not yours to fight. Some things are meant to be ignored. Some words are meant to be left unanswered. Some people are meant to be loved from a distance. Guarding your peace is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is knowing when to walk away, when to be silent, when to let God handle what is beyond your control. It is choosing prayer over retaliation, choosing stillness over restlessness, choosing faith over the need to prove yourself. The world will tell you to fight every battle, to respond to every critic, to defend yourself against every accusation. But Jesus showed us a different way. He showed us that true strength is not in proving yourself to people, but in trusting yourself to God. Your purpose is too important to be disrupted by unnecessary battles. The enemy will try to make you tired before you even get to where God is taking you. He will try to wear you out with distractions, with negativity, with discouragement. But you must guard what God has placed inside you. You must protect